Okay, thank you for coming to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John's Revenge, but you can call me PJ. Today on the show, I have the creator of the Substack and YouTube channel Europos. So, can you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and the kind of writing that you do?
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you for having me. My name is Carlos. I have a YouTube channel called Europos. I make videos on a variety of topics. They started off more as a clearinghouse for the sorts of things I couldn't explore in my day job. I was a writer for an online journal. And after I got let go from there, I started using it more to develop ideas more comprehensively, get into politics as well. Initially, it was more mysticism, theology, but I still explore a variety of topics.
Yeah, and for anybody who's not familiar with Carlos and his channel, he is here on Substack, and I'll go ahead and post that in the show notes when it's posted. But what originally drew me to you, I think first was the video about Trump being a Caesarian figure. And I do want to get into that in just a second, but I was able to kind of dig into your channel a little bit more after that, and I just really love the diversity of thought of what you bring everywhere from. Again, looking at Trump from that Spenglerian angle, as well as the more esoteric side. So that was definitely catnip for me and the type of thing that I like. But to kind of jump into that a little bit, what I was alluding to was a video that was called, the exact title was Trump Isn't Caesar, Spengler, Decline, and Destiny. And I found that particularly interesting because I think if you're in the kind of more dissident politics world, either on the left or the right, there's been a lot of talk about Trump as this kind of very singular figure. Either in some cases on the left, people see him as this dark, almost Hitler-like figure, which is a little bit hyperbolic, in my opinion. Or on the right, you have people like Curtis Yarvin or somebody like that, who, they have the concept of a Caesarian figure. I think he uses the term, a red Caesar, blue Caesar, or purple Caesar. And you're able to dig into that a little more in the context of the writer Spengler. And I've actually not read Spengler. I'm just kind of familiar with him as his concept of like the cycles of civilization. And you were able to kind of put it into context in a way that's, I thought was a little bit more sober and less sensational than in the way that it's sometimes framed on either side. So do you want to expand on that a little bit for the audience who hasn't seen that video yet?
Sure. I use Spengler. I think the term Caesarism canonically is Spenglerian, at least since Henry Kissinger decided to push Spengler on Nixon. And I think it's always sort of had this kind of background resonance in American and European thought, because some of what Spengler describes is accurate. I mean, I don't think it describes everything that goes on in a civilization, but basically what I do in that video is I provide a schematic simplification in terms of the four phases that begin with a pre-political barbarism or a pre-political social existence that eventually gives rise to cultural refinement, what he calls culture. So cultural refinement, philosophy, architecture, etc., will decay then into civilization, which is a negative sort of connotation as Spengler uses it, because there what you see is a hypertrophy of what culture used to be. So intellectuals allow their ideas to sort of become unmoored from reality, and money becomes unmoored from real value, and for Spengler, from loyalty to soil, nation, state, law. And then the Caesar has to come around and take all of those special interests, we would now say, take money and return it to its center of gravity, return it to the state, right? The economy has to be, and prosperity has to be conceived of as a metabolic process within the national body, within the body politique, within the law. It doesn't get to trespass anymore. So he brings all that together under his authority, and then eventually that makes it easier to sort of decay back into the pre-political, into barbarism again. roughly, right? Because Spengler is a complex thinker, but roughly that's what he presents us with. So the Caesar would have at least two functions. He would have to conquer internally, and he would have to conquer externally. Internally, he has to conquer money, finance, and externally, he has to usually conquer territory, land, population, resource. That's what usually what comes along with this kind of figure. Caesarism is a phase of history. It's not one person. It's not Julius Caesar. It's Julius Caesar and a whole string of figures that follow him. Obviously, Octavian's expansions are more ambitious and thorough than Caesar's, than Julius. I don't think that we can look at Trump and ignore the correspondence with Spengler's Caesar on that first point. I think that his whole appeal was, I'm going to stand up to entrenched interests. I'm going to stand up to the deep state because they transgress against the nation, because they view their ambit as the whole world, not as the United. They don't have a particular loyalty to the United States anymore. So that's very much Caesarian in Spengler's terms. But I think he's obviously attractive because he was presenting himself as a non-interventionist in military affairs. At least it seemed like, well, we're going to return to something a little more Jeffersonian, or at the very least, we're only going to get involved if it really obviously benefits us, right? If there's something specific that we can gain. But I mean, Trump was pushing back against the Bushes, and he was pushing back 2016 against all of that kind of neocon Republican ideology. Whether he really is actually going to, enmesh himself in foreign military adventurism all the same, and therefore conform to Spengler's Caesar on that second point, after all, is another question. I think that if he does allow all these neocon appointments that he's agreed to lead him in that direction, it won't be Caesarian either, because it won't be for the sake of the nation in the sense in which Spengler would understand it, the state, the law. It'll just be more of the same. It'll be more of the civilization phase. Because what's interesting about Spengler is he talks about conquest during Caesarism, but it's also something that happens in the previous phase. So civilization conquers too. Before Julius Caesar, we were conquering Hispania. Before Trump, conquest has already taken place, but there wouldn't be a qualitative difference. In my view, you would be doing it on behalf of those kinds of special interests, on those kinds of entrenched interests. You'd be doing it on behalf of Israel. At least so Netanyahu thinks. I don't think ultimately it will benefit Israel to antagonize its region in that way, but it wouldn't accrue to the glory of the state. So he wouldn't be a Caesar in that respect. So I think the natural vocation for Trump is to be, as I said in the thumbnail for that video, would have been to be a post-imperial Caesar, would have been to be Caesarian in terms of dissolving the interests that have grown up during the civilization phase, but not in terms of being a conqueror. I don't think anybody wanted him to be a conqueror. And if he ends up being a conqueror after all and expending blood and treasure abroad in the Middle East, it'll just be a prolongation of the civilization phase. That's all if we're taking for granted Spengler. If we're taking for granted his phases, which I don't think we should do, but if we do, then I think that those are the two Trumps that we could end up with. Unfortunately, it feels like we could end up with that sort of latter Trump that ends up being more influenced by the neocon appointments than by his base.
Yeah. I think that's a really good framing device for it. And I guess, to me, I think people can get maybe a little bit too caught up in looking for current historical figures or political figures to fit these molds in, an exact one-to-one way. But what I do see, I mean, I guess the questions I would put to you really are, how we want to see this moment in history, really, because the what I would juxtapose that against is like Francis Fukuyama and his end of history thesis.
Yeah.
So the concept, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast a couple other times, but for the audience who's not aware, basically the concept is with the fall of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, the liberal democracy has become, the quote unquote endpoint of history, and now military conquest in the ways that it existed in previous historical eras have just kind of come to an end because there's not really any endpoint. This is kind of a logical conclusion of that, like the Hegelian dialectic. So that having been said, I do, because for me personally, I tend to agree with you. I was never a big Trump supporter. I was kind of more in the Bernie Sanders camp, but because my biggest defense of him to my more liberal friends and left-leaning friends was, no, he's not a Hitler-like figure. He's more or less George Bush Part 2. But that having been said, I think you were right. To the degree that he's going to actually do what his base wants, remains to be seen. But it does seem to be like a significant break in the way that American politics has been going, especially since from, I would say, 1991 to when Trump's kind of rose to power. Because I wonder if you could reframe conquest not as like literal military conquest, but like a reconquista of traditional American self-determination, if that makes sense. Because the framing I think of it is like at the end of the 19th century was, when we saw the advent of, I guess, what you could call modernity, in the way that we see it, the deracinization of people and leaving their traditional lifestyles, all this technology that was ramping up really quickly, income inequality. And at that time, we saw the rise of 3 different ideologies in the Western world to try to deal with that problem. Those being fascism, when it was a little bit more collectivist, but more so for like a specific ethnicity or nation. You had communism, which was attempting to be much more universal and global. And then you had liberalism or liberal democracy, which was not exactly a synthesis. It was kind of its own thing of trying to leave everything open to the free market, both economically, culturally, everything. But it feels like we've kind of come to an end of that, like liberalism and liberal democracy and the idea of, the Wilsonian spreading of democracy. And it feels like it's kind of come to the end of its purchasing power with Ukraine and, kind of like you alluded to, Israel trying to become more hegemonic in its region. But it feels like we've kind of, at least as far as I can tell, come to the end of the purchasing power of that ideology, and even like the ability economically and militarily for the United States and the West to be able to maintain that. So in the sense that just the way that the material conditions of the world that we live in exist in, there has to be some sort of change. And I kind of see Donald Trump as, if not, if we're going to look at that Caesarean framing, I see it like, him and say Bernie Sanders are like the Gracchi brothers, if you know your history there. And for those at home, like the Gracchi brothers were before Julius Caesar took power and they transitioned from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. They were kind of populist firebrands who both had 2 unsuccessful populist revolutions. But it kind of paved the way for Caesar to take power and make that change. And I see Donald Trump, or Bernie Sanders for that matter, as a figure in those molds. So I get my question for you. That's a very long-winded way of saying, like, it feels like no matter which way you slice it, I don't think, even just on like a material level, I don't think it's possible to continue the way that we've been going for the last 30 years with American hegemony. And if that's the case, how do you see that shaking down? Is it going to be, trying to continue with the empire for a long time? Is it, how do you see that going?
Well, if we start with Tiberius Gracchus in particular, I think you're right. I think that a lot of the appeal that Trump was able to sort of awaken in the American populace had more to do with the idea of focusing political energies and economic energies centripetally back into the nation in the same way in which Tiberius Gracchus proposed to do it. To wit, let's not have this expensive campaign in Hispania. Let's make peace with the Numantines. Let's come back and reform land ownership, and that way large estates won't be bringing in slave labor and sort of dispossessing the local workforce, which is what Plutarch says Tiberius Gracchus was up to and got him killed, which is very interesting because we see the same dynamics, concentration of ownership, the fruits of our labor more or less resulting in this kind of increasingly sort of vacuuming up of the surplus. But then the way that sort of develops is that you get an internal proletariat, as Toynbee would say, that becomes rebellious, that becomes very much thirsty for some kind of a charismatic figure to mobilize its energies politically. And I think that is what happened with Trump. Geopolitically speaking, what we've seen even just in the past week should sort of give us pause as far as projecting where the American empire is going to go. If you'd asked that before the rebels in Syria had sort of escaped the Idlib stalemate, I would have said, well, it looks like Iran and Saudi Arabia have drawn together thanks to China. It looks like Russian economic growth has not been impeded by American sanctions. It looks like the Bridge, this kind of virtual currency platform that BRICS has come up with, is going to replace the petrodollar, and Saudi Arabia is not all that interested in continuing to have the arrangement that it's had with the United States. And it still kind of looks that way. It looks like the American empire couldn't open up the Red Sea with the Houthis using, cheap drones to choke international trade. It still kind of looks like the American empire is on its way out, but not quite as quickly as we thought, maybe, because Iran has not been preparing Hezbollah for war, because China and Russia are not committing to keep Assad in Damascus, apparently. Because all the preparations that people kind of intuited had already been made to get the United States out of resource-rich areas like the Middle East haven't really been done. The other guys that are replacing the American empire aren't really looking as ready, as competent as it could have seemed like they were. So where do I see it going? I think that the transition from American hegemony to multipolarity, with China being the main power on the other side of that multipolarity. It's not, it's not a Cold War. It's not China and the United States, but China is the main ascendant player. I think that that's actually going to be messier than it would seem before. And I don't think Trump is looking like the transition president, because at a certain point we could have said Trump doesn't want to be involved in all of these theaters. He wants to get along with Russia. He wants to prosper at home. Perhaps the point here, and perhaps the right way to look at Trump, is as a transition president. He's going to accept a certain contraction of American hegemony, so far as the military goes, so far as having bases abroad goes, etc., because he doesn't really see the point, but he's going to renegotiate American hegemony into an American retreat that benefits America, that benefits the American worker and middle class, whatever. That would have been the optimistic reading. Perhaps that's still in the cards, but the messier the transition gets, the more scraps you have to fight for, the less likely that is to be the case. I think with Russia, that is the case. He doesn't want to be involved in Ukraine, but with the Middle East, which is flaring up, that doesn't seem to be the case. I think he might not get involved, say like George Bush in Iraq, but the involvement might continue to sort of suck resources away from the United States. I still think that we're going to end up in that, long augured multipolarity. I still think that the United States is going to cease to be the world hegemon, but I don't think it's going to be as quick as I really did think, or I suspected it might be prior to recent escalations. But in terms of the Gracchian potential of Trump, boy, no idea. I think it's still there. I mean, if America prospers and if America is able to sort of just to find ways to distribute purchasing power equitably enough, which can be done, it's really a question of political will, then you can end up with what Tiberius wanted, which is that communities are more able to sustain themselves on their own labor because they own the productive resources, land, etc., that currently are having their surplus extracted. And if we have a quasi-socialist Trump administration in various ways, then sure, you could have that at home. But in terms of the transition from American hegemony, I think it's looking very messy. And when things get messy and you put your political capital in victories abroad, it tends to suck up all of your attention. That's where the executive ends up devoting all of its clout, all of its attention, all of the time that you have to spend negotiating with Congress and the Senate. So, that's unfortunately where my mind goes. So I'm relatively pessimistic.
Yeah, I guess so that brings to mind two separate questions, and I'll pose them both to you, and we can try to maybe do a dialogue on it. Because right now what I see with, say, the incoming Trump administration, when you're looking at the people that he's appointing, it seems to be kind of baffling in a way that if you're trying to look at it from that 5D chess perspective, that's kind of what I see from some of my friends on the right and different writers that I see. Say, what's his face, Pete Hegseth, or however you pronounce that. Kind of what I am seeing is a lot of, he's selecting for personal loyalty more than anything. And I see the best case scenario is he's going to, and I say best case scenario with an asterisk, just that he's going to be more focused on personal loyalty and kind of persecuting his personal enemies. And between that and, starting a war in the Middle East or escalating things militarily with Russia or China, between the two, I mean, I would take the former. That having been said, I think if there is any path forward to a globally stable order, you've written about the works of Alexander Dugin, who talks about the concept of Eurasianism, which is, for those of the audience who aren't aware, and I'm sure you can give a much better rundown than I could. Basically, the idea is, you have returning to regional hegemony, that, Russia and China will have its own sphere of influence. Europe will have its sphere of influence. Africa will have its sphere of influence. The United States has more or less the Western Hemisphere. So I see, if anything, a return to localism, both within regional hegemony, and then a moving away from this hyper complex system that seems to be with our government and big business and everything being interconnected, seeing more local control, kind of like you alluded to, with various local communities being able to have more self-determination. So that, to me, that seems like the best case scenario with the bad hand that we've been dealt. And I wonder if that's possible, though, because another thing that you talked about, and let me see if I can find the specific. I can't find the specific video where you talked about this concept, but it's something I've been hearing floating around a lot, about like the different camps of economic and cultural elites that exist in the United States and the world abroad. And if you see, comparing and contrasting 2015, 2016 Donald Trump with 2024 Donald Trump, he basically had, I mean, in my opinion, I don't even think Donald Trump thought he was going to win. And maybe just doing it as a lark for an ego thing, or he was doing it basically to promote his own brand. So he had a lot of difficulty with getting anything done because he had people behind him that were either not loyal or were actively working against him, or just, he's personally a very volatile person. But now you see people behind him, specifically, I don't know if you've heard the term like the Silicon Valley, the PayPal mafia.
Like Palantir and
yeah, because I think that's really the fact that he chose JD Vance, who is a protege of Peter Thiel, as his vice president. There's a lot of people, myself included, who thinks that's a signal that you're starting to see a counter elite. Say Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, some of these Silicon Valley people who feel that the adventurism abroad, the lack of secure borders, the kind of hollowing out of the American manufacturing base, all of these different things, not ideologically, but just from a practical, power politics purpose, it's hurting their bottom line. So you saw all these people starting to get behind Trump, and that's contrasted with the old technocratic elite that had existed. Some people will put it in the context of the administrative state that FDR put into existence, and you're starting to see these two camps of elites battle it out. And in one of your videos or your pieces, you discussed these elites, economic elites, who have the political and economic incentives that existed were more international in nature. And if you're looking at it in material senses, people can only act within what is, in the interest of their own material conditions, right? But this is where we're starting to see the former group of elites. They're kind of descendant, and you see who seem to like, I think, as you've mentioned, they really don't seem to like the American people, traditional American culture, and they want something that's more international. They want the open borders because that's something that serves their power. So that's another conflict that I see. And whoever is able to win that kind of internal power struggle is going to be the one who's able to shape the future, like domestically and as far as foreign policy goes. And that's going to kind of inform if we can potentially see a good future. I mean, good, again, that's a qualified statement. But if we can see something more regional and a soft landing, or are we going to see everything blow up and it's going to be a more pronounced collapse? So I know I threw kind of a lot at you there. So, I mean, respond to whatever feels like makes sense. But that's kind of the question I posed to you.
Yeah, I mean, we're always going to have elites, right? The idea that you're not going to have billionaires on either side deciding your fate to some degree is a fantasy, especially because you've already got billionaires. Once you have them, you can't get rid of them. I suppose you could have sort of gone back to the founding of the United States and tried to find a way to prevent that from being the case. I don't know what the pro-Trump elite, economic elite, tech elite wants or has in mind. I don't know what Palantir is going to look like in 10 years. I don't know what the technology that Elon Musk is developing today in terms of Neuralink is going to be used for. So I'm skeptical that it's going to be positive, or that it's going to have a preservationist effect on traditional American culture, or that it's going to be the vehicle through which we're able to sort of preserve or regenerate the identity that existed prior. But I also think that billionaires are people, and they have sympathies and they have ideals like anybody else. I don't know about Peter Thiel, but I think Musk probably is sincere. When he talks about freedom of speech, he's very selective in how he applies it. Sometimes he'll have maybe a moment in which he wants to censor a certain viewpoint because he just got the idea that, oh my gosh, that's damaging. But overall, he seems sincere. And overall, he seems committed to the premise that a nation should not cease to exist because of cultural dynamics and economic pressures that lead to low birth rates. He's talked about this a lot. He tweets about this a lot. That's a big deal. That's very important. In fact, that's the question that the first world has to deal with. Are you able to reproduce yourself physically with the standard of living that you've accrued, with the technologies that you have, with the kind of economic setup that you have? Can you even reproduce yourself? Because, yeah, birth rates are down everywhere, but in particular, the first world is sort of emptying itself out. And he seems sincere there. So I've said before that I'm not a fan of Elon Musk, and people took that. A few commenters in one of my videos took it to heart. But being a fan of a billionaire, or being a fan of somebody that has a lot more power than you, doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. I'm not a fan doesn't mean I'm an enemy, or that I necessarily think that he's not being sincere. I like Elon Musk. I don't like Peter Thiel. From what I've seen of him, I'm not sure what Palantir represents long term. I'd have to research, I'd have to listen, I'd have to understand a little bit better. But he's also been sort of in the media a little less. I don't take his he's talked about how, well, that's a different issue. He's talked about how one should not compete. One should try to be the first in line, not the third or the fifth, right? You have to find niches where no one else is competing. And if you take that idea, which he kind of arrives at via René Girard, and the idea that you don't want to be imitating, mimetic desire is bad. Okay, fine. That makes sense for an entrepreneur as well. Find a niche in the market. If you apply that to geopolitics, that means let's try to find ways in which we can develop, in which we can excel without coming into direct clashes with our rivals, because it behooves us not to, especially because, the population is already war fatigued, and there's all kinds of internal contradictions in the United States that can be exploited by outside forces. Alexander Dugin has talked about doing that. So let's try not to. Right? Let's have a niche and really develop, but let's not be competing out there aggressively with other powers. Maybe that's the philosophy that Thiel has. I don't know. I can't speak competently to what these guys have in mind for Trump or for the United States. I'm sure that they've war roomed all sorts of scenarios, and I'm sure they have all kinds of ideas that would contradict what the people that vote for Trump ideally would want. I don't trust JD Vance at all. I think a guy that writes hillbilly elegy and thinks Hitler is sort of an appropriate title to throw at Trump one day, and then a few years later you're his VP. I don't trust him because conversions are fine. You can change your mind, but it's difficult in your mid-30s to have that kind of a Damascus Road moment when you've already been in politics, or you already understand politics. I'm not convinced by by that. So I think he's probably more of an opportunist, but I don't know. I have no idea. But yeah, I think just in terms of realpolitik, you're always going to have billionaires. Pick your billionaires. Musk is better than the alternative. Fine, let's go with that. But I think really what needs to be done is that the base would have to be mobilized. It would have to be very angry and very mobilized and very willing to push back against Trump at the first sign of we're going to commit resources to this foreign adventure, or we're going to have a corporate tax cut, but what we're not going to do is a Gracchian land reform, etc. Like if the populism wanes, the base would have to call him out. I don't see that happening, unfortunately. I think what tends to happen is the opposite. There's a demobilization as soon as and in fact, that's the problem with a figure like Trump. And again, I'm very sympathetic to Trump, but I think you put so much symbolic importance in his victory, and then when he finally gets in office, that means that you demobilize. You go flaccid. The base is not really there to hold him to anything. How would it? With what leverage?
Sure.
That
And I
bodes
think,
badly.
sorry, finish your thought.
That bodes badly. No, that was it.
Okay. No, I would tend to agree with you too. And I think, and I brought up because I think Bernie Sanders in the United States is a figure that is very similar to Donald Trump, because it feels like right now the mood in the United States and really across the world is populist, right? And to me, that's again what it comes back to. I'm wondering, at least to me, like you talk about Donald Trump or whoever gets in after him. Personally, I don't really. I mean, it's hard to war game out what 2028 is going to look like, because part of me thinks that the Democrats have kind of like the Obama coalition and the Obama model has been kind of made obsolete, and I think it's shown that model that they had used to gain power in that era is, again, that's kind of out of gas, and they're going to need to reformulate. They might be able to retake the White House and maybe change course again just because Donald Trump is so singular. I don't know if JD Vance has the juice. I'm kind of ambivalent on JD Vance personally. There's aspects on a personal, like his story that appeal to me, because I mean I'm kind of more on the populist side myself, because I liked Bernie Sanders. I'm pretty ambivalent on Donald Trump, kind of for the reasons that you mentioned. That having been said, once again, what I keep on running up against is if you read about, and you alluded to demographic trends, just the production bases that exist in the West and across the world, but particularly if you look at the military capabilities of the United States and the Western world, broadly speaking, it's revealed that, we are a shadow of our former self. Don't ask me for a source because I don't remember exactly where I read it. But if we were to go to war against Iran, for example, we don't have the military base for it, but we would run out of ammunition within 3 weeks because there's so much that's been given to Ukraine and some of our other allies. And that even though Russia and China seem to be ascendant, they also don't have, even in our diminished state, the United States and the Western world still is pretty powerful. And it's not like you can knock us over with a feather, so to speak. So with all that having been said, to me, it feels like we don't even have, because people talk about the possibility of World War III. I don't think we have that in us just resource-wise. I don't think we have that in us as far as the will goes. So it feels like there has to be some sort of significant change in the way things are done. If the people in charge, the elites, if you want to use that term, if they are so ideologically committed, or if they're just going to be very cynically trying to chase power, that's always the question, right? Because some people will make it out like, democracy is a complete sham, and the elites are just, there's been some discussion about whether or not if Trump was just installed so we could have the next war. and have, because his base, which is the traditional people who will actually join the army, there's been like a 40% some odd decrease in military recruitment. A lot of people left during the Biden administration. So I guess when I say I feel like it's not possible to do what they want. That having been said, they still have the levers of control, and there might be nuclear conflict. It's hard to tell. But I don't know. What are your thoughts? What do you think there is actually a way forward? Is that even possible to wage war, like literal, boots on the ground and economic war? Because to me, it feels like it's not possible from a technical standpoint to go at the rate that we've been going. So there needs to be some kind of sea change.
But from a technical standpoint, I mean, I'm sure that the United States can engage in ground operations all over the place. But I think, I mean, if we're talking about a world war or a general regional conflagration in which Russia, possibly China, take part, or an invasion of a country like Iran, no. I mean, but not just because America would probably be so overstretched in its capacity to keep that going that it might lose and lose badly, but which doesn't mean the other side wins. It just means you lose. But also because I think the political reaction to that would be dire. I talked about the base demobilizing, but the base demobilizing doesn't mean that the United States is not, from my at least vantage, steeped in such a profound war fatigue that if you were to try to pull something like that off, you wouldn't have a real problem with your base and with everybody else. I think that Trump is unlikely, but more than that, just the political elite is unlikely to risk that. I think they're probably going to try to advance their interests in resource-rich theaters more strategically going forward. Ukraine has been very expensive. It's been very difficult to keep that going. The Trump faction wants to wash their hands of it. And yet, I say all that, but boy, the way things have gotten escalated in the Middle East, I mean, you never know, I'm not a expert on geopolitics necessarily. Not I studied international relations, but I haven't kept up with it the way I should have. But the pessimistic reading would be that you get the rebels in Syria to march on Aleppo and Homs, maybe make it to Damascus, and you use long-range missiles, or you allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles, and you do all this right before Trump comes into office because you want to mire him in these conflicts. You want to make it impossible for him not to keep it going. But keep it going wouldn't mean committing, the U.S. military a la Iraq. I don't think so. Keep it going would just mean send money and support your allies, quote unquote, with as much American treasure as you can. I think that's what keep it going means. I don't think anybody thinks that the political cost of getting involved in a serious invasion and sending the military wouldn't be disastrous at this point. I think the game is another one. I think the game is send money and send military resources if you can. At least in Ukraine. Right? Could there be something else in the cards for the Middle East? Maybe, but that's I'm sorry to say, and I don't mean to turn Israel into a boogeyman, but that's down to their lobby. That's down to how much political influence they can exert. That's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. It's well, I can't believe you didn't just solve the whole international conflict right there. Come on, man. No, but I guess that leads me to another question to kind of shift gears a little bit, because you were talking about the mobilization of bases. be it the Donald Trump's more, I guess, what you call heritage Americans, although he has pretty significantly expanded his base in the type of people he appeals to, or say, the Bernie Sanders wing, the populist wing. It seems like it's really difficult to keep that energy up because in most cases it's a negative coalition in the sense that they're against something. And one feature that I see in the United States and the Western world, more broadly speaking, and even from what I understand, in different places in the world, Russia, China, what have you, the option for positive community where traditional power bases have been formed and coalitions have been formed has been kind of completely decimated. Arguably by design, because I know you've spoken about that in some of your other work about how there is a concerted effort to destroy these traditional bases of power like nationalism, religion, traditional, I guess, ethnic groups, you might say. But that having been said, it feels like once again the idea of everybody being a rugged individual and everybody is out for themselves, that more neoliberal attitude, or liberalism more broadly speaking, once that's starting to, it's gone as far as it can go, and people are feeling more and more isolated. You're seeing that more and more kind of across the world globally, that people are desperate for community. And excuse me, I'm wondering if that's going to be the next phase of political organization, since I tend to, personally, I see the future as being more localist and finding ways to reform these traditional communities, because it feels like, kind of like you alluded to, you will say, I saw, the Occupy movement or Bernie Sanders, and they either were kind of roundly defeated or that their energy was kind of subsumed by the mainstream Democratic Party. I see that in movements in Europe as well, or the same thing with Donald Trump and his coalition. Those I guess not traditional, the more recent and modern coalitions and bases of political power, maybe by design, they kind of fall apart after they gain power. So I'm wondering if we're going to see more of a drive towards localism and finding a way to synthesize some of these more traditional identities with some of the good aspects of modernity, and whether or not you think that's possible. Because to me, it's not possible to completely, to use the meme term, return to tradition, but people are obviously hungry for more traditional communities. And to me, that's the basis of where you're going to see some of these, coalitions, are they're going to form either to try to act collectively or just say, hey, I don't want to be a part of this, I'm opting out. So do you think that's possible? Can we reclaim any of these traditional identities and communities, or is that just, is it gone the way of the dodo with modernity?
I think it's inevitable. Yeah, I think that's what always happens when you have this kind of nostalgia in people to go back to a community that they might not have actually known particularly strong communal ties or extended family or all the rest of it, but you have that strong nostalgic draw because you see the limits of the opposite, but also because it's a strategy for survival. I think tribalism begins to sort of draw you together because it's a strategy for survival. I grew up in cities like London and Brussels, and the crime rate has been steadily growing. And I think people begin to sort of imagine what it would be like if you could retreat into a community that took care of you. You do have that. You have that in a lot of communities, but they're not, you said heritage Americans. Yeah, they're not the indigenous community, right? The people that have given the most into that kind of liberal individualism tend to be the local Westerner. And whether we're going to see tribalism, I think, is the term that I would use, and it's sort of provocative, but I think it's relatively accurate, because really what you end up with is what you have in Europe, for example, with the farmer protests. I think is a good example of what politics might end up being in the future. Some folks have called it agro-populism. I think that emphasizes the farmer protests perhaps excessively. But I think that is what you're gonna see more of. I think you're gonna see an appeal to specific collectivities that until now were not being appealed to because it was seen as passé, it was politically incorrect. They represented what Arnold Toynbee calls the internal proletariat, which you don't want to appeal to politically because what you're trying to do is displace it with the external proletariat because it's cheaper, or because by not appealing to that internal proletariat, which isn't strictly speaking a proletariat in Marxist terms, but that's the nomenclature that Toynbee used, and I like it. You want to displace it, yes, because the foreign worker is cheaper, but also because perhaps at a certain point, the cohesion of your society is viewed as a bit of an impediment to the political class. You want to reduce that cohesion, so you don't want to be appealing to the redneck or the local farmer in the Netherlands or wherever else, and it becomes sort of politically a bit of a taboo. But I think we're getting over that because you're seeing all these kinds of populist so-called right parties make gains, and that in itself is already changing how the discourse gets constructed on the other side as well, because you get a reaction from the left. You get old school leftists saying, well, hey, I don't want to lose that demographic. I only lost that demographic because the folks that were running my party for some reason decided to alienate it. But I'm an old school leftist. I have no reason to alienate them. So you see that in Germany. You see, as the right grows, you also get a more anti-immigration left trying to occupy the same space, and that changes the way in which politics is, in which political rhetoric is constructed. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. That's a process that's begun now, but I think we're still a few electoral cycles away from it. In terms of localism, though, I guess you meant something else. I think you meant actually rehabilitating that kind of extended communal kinship tie, small communities, really living closer together, all the rest of it. Yeah, that's the reversal of entropy is always harder than entropy itself, right? Building communities is always more difficult. Of course it can be done. I wonder whether that's outside politics. That's culture. Politics can create, I think you can have policies that help. So for example, you can have a tax, you can have a tax system in which if you've owned the same house for 2 generations, no income tax, or we give you some other break because we want to foment generational ownership and people staying in the same place and all the rest of it, right? Or you could have a back to the land homestead act like Lincoln tried to do. Well, you could do that. You could have something like that in Europe. A lot of villages are empty. Let's try to get people to move back into them, and we'll help you do that. And in terms of technology, there are examples of this kind of thing being done. You could use an open source AI software and completely strip it of any references to foreign cultural elements and fill it up with only things that you want the kids having access to, Shakespeare and American history and all the rest of it, and use that in schools or in homeschooling. That's been done before. I think the CEO of Stability, Stable Diffusion, for example, he allows for that to be done. It's by design. You can strip it of all its content and make it fully yours at a local level. The problem with all of this is that it requires a lot of will. It's not just, when we talk about these kinds of things, we're fantasizing, right? Because this would require that people actually have the idea in their minds and actually be able to do it. Okay, let's move out. Let's buy this land together. Let's use technology in this way. That's not happening, and that's not in anybody. That's everybody has that intuition perhaps, and it's becoming more common, but it's but it would require that there be a blueprint set up already, and some kind of a work package for people to just sort of say, yes, okay, I can do that easily. That's not easy. What happened in Europe is mysterious. How did the Roman villa with slaves on it transition into the medieval village, based on a lot of mutual, we think of serfdom, but that's not what defined the entire Middle Ages or the so-called Dark Ages. There was a lot of economic arrangements, and some of them were all about shared manual labor. And that process is a mysterious one, because we don't have a particularly detailed historical record of how you transition from a kind of rigid structure to a communal structure in which the commons and collective property at a village level is the basis of life. But I think it will happen. I think it's unavoidable. I think the need for community rooted in common values, common identity, and the integration of technology, especially stuff like what I mentioned, AI platforms, etc., that can be done. You can strip it of the references you don't like and fill it up with local stuff. There's other examples too, of course. Farming innovations won't go away. If you go back to the land, you'll still have a lot of that. So I think that can be done. I don't know whether that can be done without a sort of accompanying cultural movement. I think probably that's what you need, right? In Europe, we had Christianity, we had this whole new ethos, and I think you probably need to see you need to see some kind of a cultural impetus towards locality accompany that practical work. Outside of politics can help, but that's something else. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think you had a lot of good points there. And when you talk about the transition from like the Roman controlled Europe to feudalism and how we don't know specifically what happens, I'm not a historian. I love reading about history for a hobby, but I do, I think if you could look at human nature, if I had to guess, I would imagine that it was just a function of there used to be this overarching system, the Romans and their control that existed. But after there was the collapse and the withdrawal of the systems of control that existed there, you have to do it by necessity. And I guess that's, you could either talk about it in terms of a policy decision or a mass movement from above, or just if things really kind of, collapse and those systems of support no longer exist, I think people will naturally try to, you're going to have to fill the gap with something. I don't think it's going to go Mad Max. And I think there seems like there's already organic movements, or like the very the beginnings and the inklings of these more localist community-based living that you're trying to see now. And the example that comes to mind, interesting enough, is the LGBT community. And if you I don't know how much you've ever looked into that, but I look at it and some of it seems like, they're recreating ritual and creating their own holidays, and even in some cases, like, coming of age rituals. I mean, say what you will. It's not everybody's cup of tea culturally, but I think that's a human desire that exists. And to that point, I'm wondering, because you talked again about how Christianity was so important in the formation of what we know as modern Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. It feels like in a lot of different forms, we're seeing religion become resurgent, both in traditional Christianity or traditional religious forms, or mysticism. And I want to get into this a little bit down the road about, the idea of like, new age religion and aliens almost having a religious framing to it. But I guess my question to you is, do you see, because I'm seeing that more and more, especially in the right, the online right that I see, there's a move to return to Christianity when kind of, I think, like you mentioned with I think the term was like the eternal proletariat, the farmers, what that was seen as passe, and for a long time, even in, I mean, other than like the more traditional religious right that existed, but if you were young and it it was seen as kind of, passe to be religious. That having been said, what surprises me, I don't know how old you are. I'm in my early 30s, and when I was growing up, like my teens and 20s, to be religious was the death blow to cool. You couldn't be openly religious without, it was seen as like, you might as well, be your grandpa, right? But I see for like Gen Z and younger, some of them, they're cultural figures, these streamers and whatnot, who are openly religious. So on one level, I see the return to Christianity and the rejection of, at least in the United States context, I'm not quite as familiar with the European cultural milieu, but the rejection of that, I don't know, what would you call, like strip mall Christianity, and getting back to a more traditional and community religion as a way to have community, and a lot of other new age religion also feeling that valid. So how do you see that going down? And I guess we're focusing on the United States and Europe for the most part, because that seems like where the deracinization is most pronounced. But because part of me wonders if it's even possible to go back to a more traditional religious environment like, the Western world had in the past. But also, if you look at history, there's been ebbs and flows of religiosity, and of course we didn't have the technological abilities that we had in the past, obviously. But you did see, if you read in specifically European history, when people had more or less rejected religiosity, only to come back. So how do you see that shaking out, I guess, and the rest of our lifetime and future generations?
I think religion is returning. I think we've already began to see it. So religion returns in different ways, right? You can have a sort of literalistic, iconoclastic Protestant return, which is what the Islamic world has been living through. They're coming up to, their second century of Salafism, Wahhabism. That's their Protestant reform in a sense. And it does often come after a period of relative loss of faith in religious structures. That kind of cartoonish return, or almost anti-intellectual return that divorces itself from the roots or from the accrual of theology, which it views as spurious and man-made, and these are just traditions that have been lopped onto the religion, isn't what we're, I think, likely to see now. I don't think it's that kind of religious fervor. And in the West, in any case, we've been through that. We've had Puritanism. We've had those kinds of returns. We've had a lot of them. America has periodic revivals. Evangelical revivals are a kind of weird sort of small recurrence of that dynamic, you could say. I think religion as a rediscovery of the necessity of God in your understanding of reality. And I think that that's something that comes through with debates around the hard problem of consciousness and philosophy of mind. I think that's one vector for the return of the religious. I think the sense that without a common ritual or liturgical manifestation for our being oriented towards the divine, without some common cultural framing for how we interact with the divine, we don't have a culture. That realization that without church, without mass, without liturgy, without ritual, you don't really know where the culture is stemming from or what it's supposed to be oriented towards. I think that sense of homelessness has set in. And that's why people are returning to religion, or attempting to return to religion. It's not easy to return to religion, because the thickest tradition that we have in the West comes with very specific theological commitments. And so I don't think everybody that's attracted to the aesthetic of religion and to what religion can do for you, for your family, is necessarily engaging with the fullness of that theological trajectory. But whatever, because a lot of the times that's not what conversion is anyway. A lot of the times we inhabit certain structures, including the structure of a particular church, without that meaning that we have accepted or we've even bothered to engage with the vast theological corpus that it comes with. Actually, most people's spirituality is a lot more down to earth and a lot more direct, and I think that's always been the case. I think our medieval ancestors probably were less interested in this or that encyclical than they were in the sort of bedrock theology that they would get from what Psalms they knew and what gospel passages they knew and what experiences they had. How I see it moving forward is that probably young folks will identify as religious in at higher rates than previous generations. So I can definitely see the millennial generation as being a bit anomalous with respect to whatever comes after the Zoomers, and even with the Zoomers, you do see a little bit of that. But again, I think these processes aren't so clear. I think, I think that they happen in their own time, and I think that they usually they accompany some cultural movement that is unpredictable. I don't think it's necessarily going to be Catholicism or orthodoxy that everybody goes in for, but I do think that there is already a sense of respect for the Christian story, for the gospel, that there wasn't before. I think that the culture wars have kind of turned religion into a caricature, into a sort of bit part in this play. And I think that that's running its course. I think a lot of folks do take it more seriously. If you look at, I'm not a fan of his particularly, but if you look at the way in which Jordan Peterson has been talking about religion, you get that a lot now. You get this kind of at least symbolic deference for what religion means and the psychological effect that it has. So at the very least, I think that's where the culture is at increasingly. That's not real faith, but it's something. But you're asking, how I see it moving, how I see it playing out, and that's I see it playing out the way that I think it always plays out. I think decadence leads to a return to the sacred. And I think that return to the sacred very often is led by people that have direct, real experience of the sacred and a burning sort of faith in the sacred, and they inspire others to take that up. I don't think it comes by way of a weighty theological debate. I don't think it comes by way of any of that. I think it comes by way of charismatic figures that redefine the culture in the direction of the sacred. And intellectually speaking, it comes by way of this very odd situation that we have now, where we are rediscovering classical metaphysical arguments in the context of the hard problem of consciousness. How can consciousness emerge from, non-conscious material substrates, etc., right? So we've accepted reductionism, we've accepted materialism, and then we've come up against certain limits in that direction. And that provides a sort of intellectual impetus. So that's the philosophical, intellectual side of it, right? I think that's there. But in terms of the culture, it's charismatic figures that encounter the sacred. I think God calls people to his burning bushes. And his burning bushes can be various, and his Moseses can be various. But I think that always happens after a period of decadence and materialism. Culture has these cycles. Spengler's right about that, of course. And the end of an excessively sort of stultified culture is always a return to the sacred. And in our case, it will be a return to the gospel in some form, because Christianity is the background that we have. It won't be, entirely foreign to what's come before.
I think that's a really good framing of the last topic that I wanted to get to you with. Because when you talk about the spiritual side of it, and it makes me think about for my personal experience, just for background for you, my dad was a pastor, so I grew up in the church. I'm very familiar with it, and like a lot of people my age at that time, I went through, I guess your prototypical edgy atheist phase, mostly because I grew up in a branch of Christianity that really emphasized literalism, and I think in the context of the world that we live in and the level of scientific knowledge that we have, if you try to literalize the Bible, that these are literal things that literally happened, the earth is 6,000 years old. There is literally a flood with literally two of each animal, etc. Especially, when I grew up at in the 90s and the early 2000s, where things were materially very good, it's really hard, that type of Christianity doesn't have a context anymore. Because if you look at the time that it rose in, I'm not an expert on like the American Christianity, but I know a little about it. That it was in the Great Revival periods where it was Christianity was kind of on the upswing again, but it was in the context of the progressive movement, and you're trying to have some sort of legitimacy, and you're trying to make Christianity fit with modernity. But as we're starting to see the world that had that material level of comfort go away, you're starting to see people want to, myself included, return to something more mystical, and having a spirituality to it. Because for me, I was an atheist for most of my life. I guess maybe 2/3 now, because I became an atheist in my very early teens, basically, partially for the reasons that I mentioned. But as I got a little bit older, I remember the first time reconsidering the concept of God was when I went to the Grand Canyon with my in-laws, and there was this Lakota man there who was talking about the history of his people and being connected to the land. And it was the first time I'd really thought about myself, at least thought about myself, and also being able to internalize it emotionally, that I'm not this disconnected biological node. I'm not completely a logical being. There's something else there, and I have a history and a heritage and also a spirituality. So I wonder if I would agree with you that we're going to see Christianity is, I guess, the framework or the skeleton that we're going to see. But I do see a lot of people who are also, kind of like you mentioned, more interested in the spiritual side, because between that, or I had another semi-recent experience where there's this this famous Catholic church called Holy Hill, which is in Wisconsin, where I grew up, and it's out in the wilderness. It's on top of a hill. It's like this anachronistic colonial era Catholic cathedral, not necessarily a cathedral, but very large, and beautiful traditional European architecture. And being in it, it was something that I felt that you can't quantify. And I'm starting to see, that's something I felt. Now I guess you could say I'm more agnostic and open to it. But I'm wondering, Christianity or religion is going to have to adapt to the times that it exists in, because it's something I'm reading about now, and the history of Christianity, and either starting in the first century as existing in the context of being this downtrodden minority where they're oppressed and not allowed to practice their religion by the Romans, to the context of the collapse of the Roman Empire, and the Catholic Church being a unifying force, to seeing more modernity. And then you're starting to see that's when you see the Protestant Reformation happen. And obviously I'm going with broad strokes, but Christianity in all these cases, you have this, the scripture itself, but you also have different Christian denominations that are a reaction to the material conditions that people are existing in, and they're changing the doctrine a little bit, and the spiritual practices that the average person experiences kind of reflect that. And I'm wondering in modernity if we're starting to see new synthesis of Christianity, because another thing it makes me think of is in the conquest of South America, and there, or I forget exactly the context, but it was in South America, and the initial conversion to Christianity with the indigenous people there, they didn't take it until there is a stronger emphasis on the Virgin Mary, because their culture had a very strong emphasis on the tradition of the sacred feminine. And once they were able to strongly emphasize the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary, then that's when it kind of clicked for them. So I'm wondering if we're starting to see that with the trappings of modernity and the particulars of modern America. And the last thing that made me think about one of your videos that I found really fascinating was talking about the UFO phenomenon in a more spiritual context. And I see people talking about UFOs as, and I want you explained it very well, but the idea of UFOs as being something that is a spiritual experience that is something that is kind of ubiquitous to all of human existence, and our understanding of the world was something more scientific in the 50s and 60s when that happened. So that's the form that it took, whereas in the past it could be fairies, demons, what have you. But now people are starting to, even I hear people, in the Joe Rogan sphere talking about, psychedelic experiences and using that as kind of a primer for spirituality. So if I were to make any predictions, we're probably going to see like a type of Christianity that's a little bit more holistic and incorporates either psychedelics or some of these more new age practices, because that, for a lot of Americans, that's been, it's a little bit of Buddhism, a la carte spirituality. So I don't know. I'm wondering if you see a future with that, because to me, that's what I could see. It's a proprietary blend of Christianity, kind of a la carte mysticism, Eastern mysticism, New Age, in kind of its own thing. And if you have any thoughts on that, and or specifically that theory of the UFO phenomenon as something that exists independent of humanity that we can all experience, or in general that more and more people are coming to terms with the fact that there is something higher with consciousness or spirituality, and we just need to find ways to make sense of it to ourselves. And sometimes that took a sci-fi, I guess you could say, framing, when that was our framing device in the very materialistic 50s and 60s, to us returning to it now and seeing more of a synthesis.
Yeah. Let me try to address a few of the things you've mentioned and then sort of come into that last part. In terms of the rediscovery and what I take to be the enculturation or the adaptation of Christianity to different contexts, I think the modern context being a new context, the postmodern context being every bit as new as pre-Hispanic Central America in some ways, because it's arguably harder to convert a culture that is non-Christian than to convert a culture that is post-Christian. I think Christianity, a lot of traditions contain these two elements that I'm going to mention, but in Christianity, they're quite explicit: death and resurrection, bearing the cross and dying and then coming back, right? The idea of experiencing death and embracing death, which is not necessarily embracing actual risk to your life, but as an ethos. I think that the emphasis on death and the notion that by giving yourself over in a self-sacrificial spirit, you receive greater life. So just as I stop shivering when I relax my body if it's cold, I receive greater presence and a greater ability to be in the world when I cease to resist certain evils that I'm focusing on and pushing back against. And then the ultimate sort of expression of that is, if you give your life away, you receive it, right? The cross, the image of the cross of death and resurrection. This sacred psychology that the gospel seems to teach, I think, is what is most attractive to people in pain, because you've talked about Christianity beginning with the persecuted minority. Whenever there is suffering, you don't have to be persecuted in any sort of explicit sense, although that does happen. Christians are persecuted today. A lot of people relate that to the early Christian period. But I think that fundamental orientation to life, which is self-sacrificial in the sense of I'm going to fully inhabit that spirit of bearing my cross, and I'm going to do my work anyway, even if it's dangerous, and I'm going to speak the truth anyway, even if it's dangerous. I think that's very liberating, and it comes with that other liberation, which is the liberation of forgiveness. You don't want to resent people and hate people. You don't need that. You can let that go. That's where the gospel has to be discovered. It has to be discovered on its own terms, not in terms of its cultural utility or its social utility. You have to start there. In terms of its social utility, though, I'm going to make a strange argument, which is that the idea that the divine word, or that the word of God, the creative act of God, the logos, incarnates, probably has something to do with the emphasis that, for example, Catholic laity have often placed on the commons. G.K. Chesterton famously said the problem with capitalism is not too much capitalism, but too few capitalists. In other words, there has to be an incarnationist political economy. You have to have a piece of this earth under your feet that's yours, and so does your community, your family. Every layer of human identity should have some property substrate to it. And there's arguments to be made from Leviticus and from Acts, but I think that basic idea, which is more a poetic idea, has had an impact. And I think it's an idea whose time has come again, because I think that there is this idea that, well, you're not free as a political subject unless you are economically free. And I don't want to just be free for myself. I want my family to have property. I want my community to have property. And if we don't, then we don't really exist as a community, because we can't subsist on our own. We can't make decisions for ourselves. So that's my pitch for Catholic distributism that I sort of put in there. In the case of South America and the conversion of South America, you mentioned the sacred feminine. Yeah, the Virgin Mary is a big part of how Christianity has spread historically. The Lady of Guadalupe apparition, for example, in Mexico, but not only in South America, obviously. In Europe, Marian devotion was a big part of how Christianity spread, because Mary is a sign, together with Jesus, of what the gospel is trying to say. And you don't have to be religious. You can approach this purely in literary terms. But what the gospel is doing, and why it's been so impactful culturally and civilizationally, is it's saying that the foundational moment for the human species is about to repeat, right? You have Adam, and he's created out of nothing, out of dust, and that's a new creation. It's a new thing. Human beings. What a strange thing we are. And then you have a new Adam. The whole origin is contained and packed into the middle of the story, right? In the middle of the story of history, which is a slaughter bench, you're going to have a new Adam. You're going to have this new being that's also created out of nothing, so to speak, out of dust. Like Adam, he interrupts normal causation. Why? Because of the virgin birth. So the feminine is very important there. Mary is very important. She is the means through which Jesus can be the new Adam, because his birth interrupts ordinary causation. It's like an eruption of vertical causation into horizontal causation. And that's what the cross means fundamentally, metaphysically, right? Ordinary history is interrupted by this sudden descent of the logos, which is the verticality that cuts time in two. So you have a new Adam. So now you have to contemplate that idea. Again, you can, if you're not religious, you can contemplate this just in terms of what the story is saying. What it's saying is that you're going to encounter points in history and points in your life which don't make sense unless there's something behind them, unless ordinary causation as you experience it is based on something deeper, on something else, on the spirit, right? There's an interruption. And there are moments of interruption. And in fact, ultimately in spiritual practice, we realize that moment to moment, there's always this presence behind ordinary experience. All contingency is resting on this consciousness that can observe it from a place of stability. You mentioned Buddhism. So, I mean, there is absolutely an element of Vipassana Buddhist meditation in Christianity too. You have it with the Hesychastic Fathers. There's a mystical tradition there that comes to the same conclusion, which is that contingency, as I experience all the flow of thoughts and so forth, actually, there's a witness behind it. So now we come to the UFO thing. UFOs are this weird element in our culture, right? I said before, the hard problem of consciousness seems to interrupt the natural development of materialistic scientific determinism. That kind of trajectory of thought gets interrupted because we can't quite explain the fundamental datum, which is that we are conscious and we are viewing objective phenomena. What is subjectivity? What is this consciousness, right? We're having trouble understanding it because we're trying to explain it only in terms of non-conscious bits and pieces fitting together. But heck, no matter how complexly we organize it, it doesn't quite work to explain what consciousness is. Well, the same thing happens in a certain sense in this sort of triumphalist progress into post-modernity. And now we have this completely bizarre supernatural chariot in the sky showing up, and people say, oh, they're encountering these creatures, and now the government says, yeah, no, it's real. Oh yeah, it shows up on our radars. Yeah, no, it's a whole thing. So some folks research it, and you have Jacques Vallée, who is, I don't know what his origin is. I think he's Belgian originally, maybe not. He's francophone, so Quebecois, French, Belgian. He's researched the phenomenon quite a bit. He goes back a long way, and he comes up with the theory that the phenomenon has a lot to do with something that's been documented forever. We have medieval sources that talk about Magonia, which is a city that appears in the sky, and people report talking to the beings that come down from it. And he finds other accounts and manuscripts and so forth. He says, well, this is a phenomenon that has reproposed itself throughout history, and it only looks the way it does now because we want it to look that way, because we want, how else would we explain it? We can't really make sense of a ship, like a literal ship with a sail and a mast on a cloud. There were theories that water could lose density and elevate itself, and you could have ships in the air in other eras. So in those eras, it proposed itself in that form. But those theories don't hold water anymore, so now it proposes itself in this new form. I find Jacques Vallée's research very compelling. I think he's correct. I think as far as he goes, I think he's correct. I think this phenomenon probably is, this weird interruption of our normal sort of understanding of the world, of our attempt to understand the world, probably is what in other eras was called a fairy phenomenon, what the Arabs called, the Muslims called the jinn, what the Greeks would call lower sublunary daimones. Every culture has some sense that there are subtle physically embodied but subtle intelligences, and that they can mutate their form more easily than us. They're not dense and take different forms, and they interact with us. You know, I'm happy to think that that is all grounded in some reality, that there's something to that. And I think Charles Upton, he's another researcher, he's written about this. I find that all very convincing. I think an element of it is just what we in the Christian tradition call demonic fixation. If you hear the descriptions of abductions and all the rest of it, they're not pleasant. And I think that's just a negative spiritual encounter. I think that's what tradition called the demonic. I don't know what direction you want to take the conversation at this point, because I could derail us. And I've also mentioned some other stuff that's unrelated to the UFO phenomena. So orient me as you will.
No, dig into that, because that's just as maybe a little bit of a prompt, because it's something, because it, again, for a large portion of my life, really up until the last couple of years, I was intensely materialist until I had, kind of like you mentioned, experiences in my life where, because for a long time I thought, I can handle pretty much anything that comes in front of me. I can learn, I can prepare, I can do something. And then it wasn't, necessarily like a UFO experience, but it just the experience that I think pretty much everybody will have in their life at some point, where, okay, I've taken on more than I can chew. You hit the wall. For me personally, I had at the time I thought it was a heart attack, but it was a panic attack when I was 30, just because I was working myself too hard, taking on too much. And I started to try to change the way I thought about things and become more open to spirituality. And to your point, maybe if you want to dig into some of the more the Christian tradition, because I'm very interested in Christian mysticism, because I remember, weirdly enough, one of the first things that made me rethink these things, Christianity and mysticism, because there was a guy named Damien Eccles, who was like a Satanist, who talked about how when he was trying to get into some of the esoteric traditions, he would initially do some of these Eastern mysticism, and he could just never really quite find a connection there. It never worked for him until he took on the Western esotericism, which is inextricably bound with Christianity, even if it's just in its an inversion. That's when it all started making sense for him. And that's when I started to rethink spirituality, mysticism, the esoteric, occult, whatever you want to call it, in a different context. And the last experience that, was a framing device for me, and I'll hand it back to you if that's hopefully pushing you in a direction. Because I remember years and years ago, I've not done a lot of psychedelics, but I did. It was illegal in the US for a while. Salvia divinorum, which is it was a hyper concentration of I think it's sage or something. And it was popular, traditionally used in South America, but it's more or less DMT. And I remember when I did it, it was really essentially more or less like experiencing ego death, what it's like to die. And I won't, bore you with the whole specifics of the trip, other than near the end, it was all very pleasant until there was this, I encountered this entity that was like a very stern, but not unkind, feminine entity that was, more or less saying, you're not on the right path. You need to get your shit together. I guess you could say very maternal, really. And kind of all of those experiences were able to solidify in my head, and being open to Christian esotericism in that tradition. And again, thinking of, even like the UFO phenomenon or demons in the same context. So if that answers your question of the direction to go in, because it's something that your video was really good and really succinct, but it's not the first time I'd heard it. I think you mentioned Tucker Carlson talks about it. Some people like Graham Hancock or New Age. Jacques Vallée was one of them who I've read a little bit of. I can't think of all the other ones, but even independently, funnily enough, I came up with a similar concept when I was playing like a role-playing game with my friends where it was set in the modern world, and my thought was, well, what is the how can I make aliens and demons and fairies, how can I make this all exist in the same world, just in a fictional context? And I thought of something similar, and it sounds like this is something that is a lot of other people have come to this conclusion. So maybe a long-winded answer, but I guess that's my answer and my framing device for you.
Yeah, well, in terms of UFOs in particular, or the abduction experience in particular, from what I've read, a lot of the obsession with the human subject and human physicality and the reproductive faculty in particular, these kinds of tropes that tend to come up in the abduction experience, they are quite consistent with the sort of thing that you find in Christian literature to do, again, with demonic vexation. Now, that relates to Christian mysticism. The experience you had on psychedelics, perhaps, I don't know how psychedelics work. I haven't taken psychedelics. I'm personally extremely weary of the use of substances to prompt an experience that nonetheless maybe occurs in the context of mysticism anyway, because often it does sort of get described in terms of a hierarchy of experiential steps that eventually sort of culminates, and that you do get that in mysticism. But anyway, in terms of demonic fixation, in the Christian mystical tradition, you find, for example, in the Philokalia, which is an Orthodox Eastern compendium of saints and their reports, you find the encounter with the demonic occurring occasionally as one enters into the hesychastic, which means that the silent state. As you enter into self-emptying and deeper silence, and in course of a spiritual exercise, as you enter into the silent prayer, which is no longer verbal, you risk encountering the demonic. And the demonic might, according to some saints, manifest itself visually in terms of auditory and visual hallucination, etc. One of my favorites is Evagrios the Silent, who died, I think, in 399, and he writes about the silent prayer. And some people, I think, would be surprised to realize that in his treatise on prayer, and in a lot of the Philokalia, what you get is the injunction not to use images when you're offering up your devotion to God. You're moving into a formless and a silent state. So you're no longer imagining Jesus or a cross or in any form at all. In fact, it's dangerous to do that. You're entering into a state of pure contemplation of the divine, right? That famous phrase, I just sit down and look at God, and God just sits and looks at me. That's all it is. I become transparent to the transcendent. And you get that in the Western tradition too, like in Meister Eckhart and in a lot of Catholic saints. It just tends to be a little more sporadic and less systematic than how our Eastern brothers have put it together. But the demonic is a sort of objective corollary of what your own mind is trying to do when you're, so to speak, bringing it to heel, which is that it's angry and it's resistant and it doesn't like what you're doing and it doesn't understand what you're doing. So all the forces, all the energy that usually are circulating around your head or your body, you have all these vital energies that are constantly at work because we identify ourselves with our anxiety and our problem solving and our fixations, and we're always on that. So when we suspend them, we feel like we're dying because we feel like we are those things, and all those energies get released, and it can be very volatile. And that can cause this kind of experience, this kind of, at the extremes, hallucinogenic experience. However, that can then dovetail with an actual external entity, and this is where the faith comes in, right? This is where Christianity believes in actual spiritual, externally real spiritual realm. So that can dovetail with real entities that want to use your pain and want to use this opening to torment you and to stop you from advancing on the spiritual path. And the way that they do that is to scare you. Evagrios tells us that they actually don't just scare you, they also try to seduce you. So the demonic is always going to come in two. It's going to come in one team that comes around and says, I'm going to do terrible things to you. You should be very afraid. And another team that comes around and says, I'm going to save you. Come here. You know, I'm going to
Good cop, bad cop, classic.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And, you know, he's talking about the demonic, but that's how psychology works. That's how the mind works. Oftentimes, you'll have to deal with the thing you're afraid of, but you're also going to have to deal with the thing that you're not afraid of. You are seduced by it, attracts you, right? You always have aversion and attraction. You have to deal with both. In politics, you get that too. That's the political theater. You have to be suspicious of both. But I believe in the demonic, obviously. I believe that there is such a thing as the demonic because I'm a Christian. But I think a lot of the dynamics that are played out there are dynamics that also occur in the mind itself. And so in Christian mysticism, and a lot of traditions, but in Christian mysticism, you get this kind of understanding that if you begin on the path, be earnest, because you're actually going to suffer at some point. You're going to encounter these sorts of things, and it might be your mind or the flesh. Is the terminology is the flesh. That's how Paul talks about it. The lower self, I guess, in a more New Age sort of sense, lower self. It's going to rebel against you, and you're going to have to deal with it. Also, external forces are not happy with you doing what you're doing, and they're going to come around and they're going to try to torment you too, whether visually or not. For most people, not. Most people don't have any kind of hallucinatory reaction to prayer, to contemplative prayer, to long sort of sessions of prayer, but the tradition warns us about that. People that are experiencing UFO encounters haven't been praying. They haven't been on retreat. They haven't been at a monastery. It's just happening spontaneously. The Christian would probably say it's not that spontaneous. There's some door open. It can be that you were experiencing, you dabbled in the occult, or somebody in your family has dabbled in the occult, or whatever it is, right? Christianity would usually say there's some cause to it. There's some door that's open to it. It might just be as simple as fascination. Demonic fixation can be the result of fascination. In fact, mental fixation is often the enemy, right? Becoming obsessed with something is often the culprit of a spiritually crippling state in Christianity. Becoming sort of putting all your energy and all your time into an idea that keeps reproposing itself. Nowadays, we talk about intrusive thoughts or obsessive compulsive disorder, stuff like that. That's in the tradition, but that's something to wrestle against. I really had a few light bulb moments. Now I'm not talking about Christian mysticism. If you want, I can stop. But I had a few light bulb moments reading about UFO encounters and stuff that really kind of confirmed to me that this is a spiritual phenomenon. I think it was John Mack. Is that his name? Maybe not. But he's the guy that wrote Communion, which was then turned into a movie, and it's about a UFO abduction. And this man has reported being abducted throughout his life. And I remember reading or seeing an interview with him in which he said, no, they smell bad. They smell really bad. They smell like rotten eggs. And I thought to myself, oh, but sulfur? Really? That's on the nose, you know? That's very on the nose. So, you know, there's elements there that I think make it pretty clear that this is not a being from another planet, that this is something else.
Yeah. I guess I have I don't want to keep you too long, but I have one final question just to kind of build on that. I guess what's your thoughts on, because you're obviously you're a Christian, but it sounds like you do have at least an open perception to a larger perspective. Because when you talk about all these different things, you know, these different cultures that have parity, with the you know, demon or the jinn, et cetera, or even the modern secular context. Because part of me, like, and again, the way I was able to square the circle and become more open to it is, you know, this is not my theory, obviously. This is just me gleaning what I can from, you know, people like yourself, Jacques Vallée, et cetera. You know, some of the more new age thinkers in this camp. But it feels like there is something that is unique about human consciousness that, either by divine intervention or once you get to a certain level of evolution, or maybe it's just different ways, you know, different languages of looking at the same thing. It feels like different cultures throughout history find this problem of consciousness and the, you know, these external forces, or, you know, even things that are internal. And religion, and I know it sounds like you don't necessarily love the overly materialistic interpretations, but there's different ways that cultures will come up with to deal with this problem. And it takes the form that is specific to a culture. And that's kind of what I alluded to when somebody who is specifically seeking out the bad, and, you know, the case of Damien Eccles, of a Satanist, it makes more sense and it's easier when you are acting with a cultural tradition that you grew up with and you have context with. So I guess, do you think that there's anything there that, you know, because I know there's not, especially in the Christian tradition, you know, the idea, you know, all religions are basically the same and it's just flavor text, which is not what I'm saying, but it seems like there is something that humanity comes up with independently. And I think some of the problems with the new age religions, or even specific to psychedelics, because I only did it the one time, I don't have a desire to do it again, because in that, like, another strong impression I got was like, I'm somewhere where I wasn't supposed to be. You know, I'd walked into a religious ritual that, you know, that I have no context for. So sometimes, you know, I've heard, you would read about people who would talk about a psychedelic experience in the same sense that, you're bringing about physically through a drug the physical feeling of a religious experience, but you don't have the cultural context. And I read about Buddhist monks, or even when you talk about prayer, like the tradition of prayer in the West that seems to be lost is almost meditative. And you would have to go through all these levels of ritual and learning and being a part of a specific community to get to this higher level of consciousness. And when you just take LSD, which I think from a psychological perspective, it removes your novelty filter. So you have that sense of oneness and connection with everything. But if you're not anchored with a specific tradition, that's why people have bad trips. And, you know, some people, you might say that's a demonic influence. You could take the more materialist psychological perspective and say, you know, your repressed childhood memories are coming back to haunt you. But again, I guess I have a bad habit of doing this. My rambling question to you is, do you think that there is something universal there that religion or philosophy, the psychology, even something as banal as, like, you know, fortune telling, these are just languages that humanity uses to describe this spiritual dimension that exists? Or obviously you're a Christian. It sounds like there's something very specific about Christianity. What are your thoughts there?
I think that the encounter with being, the sort of realization that consciousness, as you said, human consciousness is very special, and that there is an irreducibility of the subjective experience to any of the objects of experience. I think that realization or that sort of fundamental insight, of course, always leads to a deeper, adventurous yearning for that mystery and the mysterium tremendum. What is it then? What is consciousness, and where does it come from? And obviously, if I can't explain it in terms of merely material blind processes, then I have to explain it in terms of something else. The Bible describes God, or God describes himself in the Bible at one point, at least in the Greek of the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, as haon, right? Tell them I am sent you. That's a giveaway there, right? Okay, I am. So we're dealing with the manifestations, the theophanic encounters with beingness itself, with the root itself, with consciousness itself, we might say, right? Because being, the ultimate root of reality, is taken to be not electricity or not a rock. It's taken to be a perfectly absolute, non-contingent, non-composite consciousness at the root of our being in all these traditions. It's not dead matter, and it's not blind happenstance. It's consciousness, or the root of consciousness itself. Reality is a subject, not an object, ultimately. So when you're asking, well, what are all these different rituals? Aren't they all just ways of speaking to that search for the ultimate, right? Fortune telling, and this religion and that religion. The point I would make is that you have to sort of view them in first of all, hierarchically. So what is the purpose of fortune telling, or what is the purpose of this or that ritual? Often what you will find is that in some religious practice, the purpose is to interact with contingent beings, imagined, real, whatever. We can have different opinions, but the point is to interact with specific contingent beings, because being itself, the absolute mystery of consciousness, the root of reality, isn't really on the table. It's just not part of what's being discussed. There was a very interesting interview that I listened to, and I've referenced it in one of my videos, of a fellow from the Amazon who talks about how, in our tradition, we have a concept of God, of the one God, but he's very, very far away. The only way that you would interact with him is you would interact with a spirit, or you would interact with this, and maybe he would have the ear of some higher being that maybe knows someone who knows the one God. It's all very remote. And I think that process of becoming remote is a predictable element of how religion degenerates. So I think the idea that you cannot enter into knowledge of or communion with the one source of everything, all you can do is interact with various contingent beings that maybe can give you fortune and wealth and this and that, or whatever, or virtue. It could be good things, but you're not really seeking after the ultimate mystery. That happens quite often. And I think that's what the Bible polemicizes against when it talks about polytheism. It says, well, you're involved in all of these lower order goods, and some of them might not be good at all, but whatever. You're interacting with all of these other categories. They could be intellectual categories, they could be actual disincarnate beings, whatever you think their gods were, but you're losing the point, which is to anchor in the one being, right? I think that happens with Christianity too, by the way, very often. I think with Christianity, sometimes you get lost in a lot of theological nonsense. I think there was some validity to the Protestant critique that some Catholic devotion ended up being very populist. I have a lot of saints and I have a lot of whatever, but you're really not looking for God in all of that, right? That can happen. That can happen as well in Christianity. So that's the point that I would make. Yeah, maybe they're all ultimately at some point in their genealogy about God, or about, the ultimate mystery of consciousness. I don't mean mystery as in you can't know it. I mean mystery sort of in the sense of you have to, it's a non-discursive, or you have to approach it in terms of as an experience, and not as a problem to be solved, or discursively. So I think, yes, maybe they all come from that, but they're not dealing with that now, and you have to view them hierarchically. And a lot of these practices are very spurious, and they're not oriented towards the divine at all. What's special about Christianity? Well, I wouldn't really say, I wouldn't put it like that. I would say what's special about the gospel story, what's special about Jesus, is the idea, and this is my understanding of Christianity. Other Christians, of course, will disagree, but my understanding is that what's special about it is the idea that, as I said before, the origin reproposes itself in the middle of the story, so that Jesus and his virgin birth and his resurrection are a sign that contingency and causation rest on the absolute, that you can interrupt it. You can have a virgin birth, that death is not permanent, that you can have this resurrection, right? What it is it's an interruption for you to then contemplate, oh, okay, I see. All of time and all of the cause and effect that I observe are a beautiful tapestry, but there's a table underneath them holding them up. The contingent rests upon the absolute. We depend upon that which is beyond us, right? God. That's what the eruption, the incarnation, the eruption of the Logos in history represented. And it doesn't mean other myths are untrue. I think a lot of old myths, a lot of religious traditions are true. They're inspired by God as well. I believe that. So a lot of folks would disagree. They say, no, that's, it's the biblical lineage, the prophets, and that's what's true. I don't think that. I think that the divine has revealed itself variously in many myths and in many traditions. Yeah, I believe that. I happen to believe that our contingent history, this history that we're in the world at the same time, that's tremendous.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. We happen to be living through this particular iteration of reality. It has a center, and I think that center is Jesus Christ. Other worlds can have other centers. There was a poet, a Scottish poet, I don't remember his name, but he said there can be infinite worlds and infinite histories, but each one would have its Bethlehem. Each one would have that mystery revealed in that form. But yeah, I think the divine has there is a center in the same way that the body has a heart, but that doesn't mean the other organs are not real and that they don't have that they're not necessary. So I think the divine reveals itself variously, even in the life of an individual. I think revelation happens.
Well, man, I could talk to you about this for hours, but I do want to respect your time, so I think it's probably a good time to cut it off. But I'd love to have you back on sometime to keep discussing this. This has been fascinating.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, I think the second half of the podcast was particularly interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I always have just a couple things that I like to sign off with. Do you have any upcoming videos or articles or anything that you want to promote, anything that you're particularly excited about?
Well, I'm just going to keep posting videos on my channel. I'm going to set up a Patreon at some point. So some videos will go there. Some longer versions of videos will go there. If folks are interested in some of what we've talked about here, especially towards the end, I have a book called Metapolitics, City of God, Cities of Men, and that's available on Amazon or through Angelical Press. But that's it. Oh.
Cool. Well, I guess my final sign-off question that I always try to end with, since we got a little bit doom and gloom on the first half of the podcast, what is, if anything, is making you hopeful for the future right now, or what's something that would make you hopeful for the future?
I think I think we have to be optimistic. I think folks have a lot of information available to them, and that means that the people that are interested in problematics, whether they're social or whatever it is, can find the information they need to sort of grapple with that, which is very interesting because we live in the era of the internet. So I think that that's something to be optimistic about, because you can see the human spirit getting crushed in all sorts of ways, but there's also a lot of potential for the human creative dynamic spirit to latch on to information and to contact other people and all that. So the internet, I think, is good and bad. Technology is good and bad, but the good is definitely there. In terms of being hopeful for the future, yeah, I think a lot of a lot of signs point to people being quite involved in sort of grappling with the evil of our time and political manipulation, all the rest of it. I think there's a decent amount of awakening out there. So yeah, no reason to be pessimistic. I think.
Awesome. Well, Carlos, this has been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate your time, and yeah, have a good one.
You too. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.